Awesome. Yeah, so we'll be talking today with recruiter Yiorgos, and what we'll be focusing on is tips on applying for Canadian jobs, especially from abroad. And so we had a chat a few weeks ago, and I thought you had some really good advice that we don't often see online. So why don't we do this? Why don't we do an intro while we're waiting? There's a few people coming on in. Yiorgos, I'd love to introduce yourself, what you do, what you're interested in, and then what we're going to do is Yiorgos will give a bit of a chat with some of his tips, and then we're also going to stick around for a Q&A. So if you do have questions, then feel free to either put them in the chat now. We'll probably save them for the very end, but we will stick around if we have to. We'll scroll up and we'll go through all of the questions. So Yiorgos, on to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Thank you again for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
On a Sunday.
A Sunday, nice bright Sunday morning, so it's perfect. As Josh said, my name is Yiorgos. I work in recruitment. I've been a recruiter for now close to 15 years, so I've been fortunate to speak to a lot of people over the years and have various types of engagement while I've worked in different industries. I started my career working with newcomers. So I ran a program that helped newcomers to Canada, specifically youth, find their first job opportunity, which was very eye-opening in terms of the experience of someone who lacked Canadian work experience, as they say, as they came into the market and tried to bridge that barrier. And from there, I've always worked in positions where I've connected with newcomers. And so it's an area that's very close to me. I am a child of newcomers as well. I've also been fortunate to work abroad and apply for jobs while I was there, which was a very different experience than what I was used to in Canada.
Which country?
Yeah, so I've lived in Scotland, so Glasgow, and I lived in Switzerland in case Geneva for a little bit as well. And so just that whole process and people not knowing the places you've worked or like your jobs and having to introduce yourself in a way that felt like you were starting completely from scratch. So I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit more about the experiences I've had in terms of recruiting newcomers. Specifically in the last the last 5 years, I've worked in tech. And here within Toronto, just within a variety of startups as well. And so it's an area that I'm focusing on quite a bit lately. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's jump right into it. Again, we have some awesome viewers that are already live. Guys, if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in chat or save them to the end. We will stick around to answer them. Again, thanks for tuning in on a Sunday. I'm going to turn it back over to Yiorgos, and excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that idea of having to introduce yourself and where you're coming from. And I think something that is quite apparent over the years of meeting with newcomers, from having read, I think at this point probably thousands of resumes, and it seems like a fair guess. One thing that happens when you've only worked in places outside of Canada, say, and you haven't worked for necessarily companies that are obvious to a Canadian recruiter or someone who spent their life here, is needing to take a little bit more time in your resume or in your application to explain the places that you've worked. So I think that's really important. So if you have worked at a startup, say locally, but it's not one that's well known, maybe take a few sentences within your resume to just talk about what they did and maybe what they were known for and some of the successes that they've had. I'd say that's a really important piece to make that little bit of extra effort. The same applies to universities and colleges that you may have attended. Again, someone like myself, I've been educated here in Canada. I'm not overly familiar with universities that are abroad or colleges. I don't know what their rankings are or what they're known for and their specialities. So if you can spend that extra little bit of time maybe on your resume to just kind of add that sentence or two that just highlights why this is a place that you are proud to have gone to, and again, maybe what their focus areas are.
Could you give an example of maybe what that one sentence might be for a company?
Yeah. So I work for a company, I'll just use this as an example. So I work for a company now called Jobber. It's not necessarily a startup that most people in Canada would know, but we are the second fastest technology second fastest growing technology company in Canada, and the 7th fastest growing business. So there's like a very like quick kind of one-liner about, hey, you might not know this company, but look at what we're recognized for doing.
Right.
Now, it doesn't have to be the most, you don't have to win like awards or any of that. It doesn't have to be that extreme. But even just to describe like what your product is and what you do, I think is a great place to start.
Absolutely. I remember a friend of mine was telling me about Flipkart, which is like the Amazon of India, and I'd never heard of it before. So if you've worked at something like Flipkart, would a line kind of like, would saying like the Amazon of India be a good idea, or kind of making a comparison to a North American company?
It's not a bad idea. Because then that way the potential recruiter or hiring manager who's reviewing your application might have some familiarity there. Right. So I don't think that's a bad strategy. Right. I guess it just goes back to the idea of like, if you think of how myself as a recruiter gets these applications. And so I'm logging on to what we call our applicant tracking system. So it's just basically a database. Mm-hmm. And so if I pop open a role, that's where all of the resumes go. And I'm screening them one after one another. Mm-hmm. And I think they estimate that on average, a recruiter spends about 6 seconds on each resume, which is
6 seconds.
Yes, which still gives me anxiety to think that I would only spend that little time. I like to think I spend more, but I'm sure I'm no different.
Yeah.
And so when we're going through the resume, you're really just looking at like, what's your title and where did you work? And so exactly what you said, like that's a way to get someone's attention.
Right. And it sounds to me, if I can kind of summarize that point, is to objectify the company as much as possible. So when you use statistics, like you're making it objective, right? Second quickest company, or tech company, 7th overall. So make it objective for them.
Yeah, I really think numbers help a lot in resumes, both when you're describing the places you've worked, but also if you're just thinking in terms of what you've accomplished. And so being focused on sort of, here's the data points that matter to me,
right,
or that what I was evaluated against.
Right.
I think that is something I've learned over the years, that is not just about, here's like a sentence about what I did, or a little bit more abstract. Just, keep it to the good stuff. And to me, the numbers always stand out.
Of course. Yeah. Awesome. Great tip number 1, guys. So make sure to, especially if your work experience is from abroad, make sure to kind of objectify the company, make it clear what the company does and how good it is.
Yeah. Something else I've recommended in the past for folks who either have international experience or just in the process of coming over to Canada and trying to get yourself set up with a job opportunity is look at the places that you're applying to and see if anyone has a shared background with you. And so maybe they've worked at a company that you've worked at before. Maybe they've gone to an institution that you did. Try to look for those familiarity points. Oftentimes people default to just getting in touch with the recruiter, which I'm very thankful for, that people think to add me on LinkedIn and think to ask me messages. So this is not a point to take that away, but more or less think everyone is often reaching out to the recruiters. And so we can get easily distracted or easily not notice messages. But maybe if you are applying for, say, I'll just pick one of the banks in Canada, so one of our top financial institutions or the consulting firms, there's bound to be more than one employee who has something shared with you in terms of where you're coming from. And so if you reach out to maybe those folks, it's a way to kind of get that story started and to get those introductions. Because oftentimes those people are incentivized to get in touch with you as well. So in Canada, a lot of our companies have what we call referral programs. And so it's an incentive program where either the person who refers you can get money or other rewards for someone successfully being hired. So it's something else to think of, is like who you're reaching out to, not just the message that you're sending as you're reaching out.
Right. So I think it's a great idea, and I've heard that from other people as well. So let's say you're a data scientist, you're applying to RBC, you find another data scientist at RBC who came from your country, or et cetera, et cetera. how do you recommend approaching that conversation?
Yeah. So this is definitely like a, I think, very North American way to do it, but like it never hurts to compliment the person. And so give them a why in terms of why they should connect, why they should be excited to meet. So maybe you compliment them on their background. Maybe there's something in the way they talk about their experience. Or if we're using like a bank example, say they just did something really cool in the data science field in the bank at large, and you can mention that. So I often think don't start with yourself, but start with why you're reaching out to that person specifically and what excites you about them. Now, on the flip side, you also have to give that person a reason to be excited to speak to you too.
Right.
So make sure that your profile has call to actions. Make sure that it showcases your experience in a way that's different from everyone else. And so it's kind of that, like, you have to think of it from both the sender and the receiver, I guess. Yeah, for sure.
That's a really good point about, let's call it, optimizing your profile.
Yeah.
Do you have like one or two tips on how to do that? You mentioned have a call to action, explain your experiences in a unique way. Any other tips?
Yeah. In terms of just getting started, so something that I used to do and still do is find profiles of the people who are doing the job that you want to be doing at maybe a similar company than the one that you want to be doing at as well. And so I often will go search for recruiters in other countries and look at how do they describe themselves? How do they talk about their background and experiences? What do their about me's look like? And then I look at that, put it together and say, okay, well, what makes sense for me? So I often say, like, that's a good place to start, is think of and try to find profiles that you yourself are excited by. I mean, if you're excited by it, then it must be a reason.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, like often
I'm gonna have to do the same thing too after this. Yeah.
Often we try to start from scratch, and I think you don't necessarily have to do that. Of course, be very mindful of the profiles you're looking at. Like if you are applying for, I don't know, let's pick Rituals, a fairly large startup here in Toronto and internationally as well, it's growing, is maybe don't look at the profiles of people there if you're going to be applying for jobs there.
Right.
You want to be careful not to repeat something. But if you're looking for, just look for different cities outside of the ones that you're applying to, and you're bound to find something. Yeah.
Awesome. So Gabriel, thanks for the question, and we are not ignoring it. We were just saving some of the questions for the end. But this kind of comes into, I think, where we're headed and what I was going to ask next, which is, you mentioned getting so many messages and invites on LinkedIn. I can only imagine as a technical recruiter. What are the messages that stand out the most, or basically kind of the way Gabriel asked it? Do you have any recommendations for someone applying from abroad to Canadian companies on LinkedIn?
Yeah, so be specific. So if you're reaching out to me and you're wanting to connect and you're wanting to learn more, so one is like make sure you add a note through that connection. I have hundreds of people who are waiting for me to accept their request, and I just don't know who they are and how we came across one another. And unfortunately, LinkedIn right now is a platform for a lot of cold selling. And so I'm just reluctant to say yes, and maybe that's not a great thing on my part. So try to be specific. Gabriel, a way I'll answer your question is give an example of what I think is bad or less recommended. Is if you say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I'm looking for a job at your company, what do you think I'm qualified for? It's like, that is always something that I have a hard time responding to, because you're making me do the work. And you're making me go through your profile and then trying to match. What I would prefer would happen instead is you tell me what your strengths are and what you are wanting to find in your next opportunity. And if possible, tell me the job that you want to apply for specifically, or the one that application kind of excites you. So definitely just like be specific. But often the most common request I get is just like, take a look at my profile. Are there any jobs that are good for me? And that just, again, in the volume of what we do, it just makes it really hard to respond in that case. Yeah,
I mean, I get posts like that or notes like that too, because now we're getting into some of the recruitment stuff. And from the other, I don't know if this kind of enters your head as well, but my thought is like, if you're not willing to do the work to just look on, like for example, look on Jobber's website and see what roles fit you best, then are you the type of candidate that we want to put in front of our team? Because if you're not willing to take the extra 5 minutes to do that, are you willing to work hard for a company type thing?
Yeah. And it definitely shows too of like how specific is this note? How specific is this reach out? I get it. I cut and paste a lot of my messages too. I know when I've been on the job market before, I've just changed one or few lines here and there. So that's also something maybe I'd recommend is like try to think of a couple of introductions that you can use over and over again, but look for ways that you can make them specific each time you send it. So whether that's including my name, whether that's including the company I work for, maybe it's the role, just try to add those additional pieces. It is a lot of work. Like Gabriel, you're asking the question, I'm sure others are thinking it too. Like I don't want to make it seem as though this is easy. It's a lot of effort, but the payoff will be there.
But that's the thing, because especially when you're applying from abroad, like what we try to do with our content at Visto is we're not trying to paint the rosiest picture, right? It's hard, right? It's flat out hard to find a job from outside of the country. So you're gonna have to put in that little extra effort to give yourself a chance, especially with so many other people that are interested. So if you do put in that extra, maybe 10 minutes per company, look up the role that fits you best, send a custom message. Like you said, be specific. Hey, I'm really interested in this role. What would you recommend? Or I'd love to chat about it. You know, take as much work away from the recruiter as possible, and hopefully that'll give you a much better chance, especially to stand out. I mean, Yiorgos said it himself. He has hundreds of people queued up that have requested his connection that he doesn't have time to get to. If you do make a very specific custom note, that could be one way to stand out from the pile.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, again, I said this word a few times and I'll keep on repeating it, but you're trying to get the person excited to find out more about you, to want to connect and to want to move you forward. So if you think of it from that way, it's like, why should this person reply? If you can't answer that based on what's in your profile or based on your messages, then I do think you have to kind of add those pieces right away.
Right. And the last thing I'd add is, like we alluded to earlier, make it as easy as possible for them to answer you and do as little work as possible. So don't ask them to look at your resume. Don't ask them what role would be the best fit. Do as much of that work on your end as you can for them.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to leave the recruiters in a position, or hiring managers, where they're putting together pieces of your story on your behalf. That's always something that I think doesn't necessarily lead to a successful outcome. You want to tell us as much as possible. Otherwise, we start putting pieces together ourselves that might not be true, or that just might not reflect what you're looking for.
Great point. So, Yiorgos, I wanted to ask you to talk about one more specific topic, because when you and I had coffee, it was something that I haven't heard many people discuss and I think is super important, which is that first interview itself. I don't know if you remember, but you gave a few pieces of feedback about what a lot of people do wrong in their first interview, and I'd love for you to share that with the audience. I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I think most of the time, and you can let us know in just sort of the chat function too if this is true, but your first point of connection is a phone screen. And so the recruiter will call you. You'll usually have between 15 to 30 minutes, and it will be that first talking point to tell us about why you applied for the role and how you're qualified for it. I've been doing these for years, and there are just certain things that haven't changed over those years. So whenever I do my phone screens, I'm usually in like a very small office all by myself with like no windows and the doors closed.
Kind of like right now.
Yeah, where we are here. And so it's a bit isolating. And so think of the recruiter being in that type of space. Or I've worked in other places where we are sitting at our open office desk and there's lots of people around you. So unfortunately there could be those background noises and distractions. So if you think, hey, where's the person who I'm speaking to during this phone call, then that might tell you about how you pace the conversation. And so when I give you a call, I want to hear sort of like a little bit of, hey, how are you? Like, how are you today? tell me, I always start with like, what do you know about the company and why did you apply for the role? So have those talking points ready right away. So that way it shows me that there's enthusiasm. The thing that I've noticed that a lot of folks do, especially if I noticed a lot of newcomers or people who are applying from abroad do, is I think there's this fear of, oh, I have to tell this person everything I can within the 30 minutes. And that is just not how the conversation will work. If you have sat on a phone screen and you've talked for, say, 25 out of the 30 minutes, then that's not a good sign, because that means the recruiter didn't have a space to ask you more questions or to poke into a little bit more detail about your background and experiences. And so that should be like a telling point right there. And so something that I had said, I think when we met, is just, your goal isn't to tell me everything about yourself in a phone screen. It's impossible. Your goal is to get me excited to move you forward to next steps. And so if we use your example that you said before about a data scientist, so if you're applying for a role as a data scientist, don't think of everything you've done, because it will be impossible to tell me all of that. Instead, think, hey, what are like 1 to 2 projects I'm really proud of that I'm able to go into more detail about on the phone, and try to look for ways to maybe check in with the recruiter as you are talking about those experiences. And so I've recruited data scientists before. I am not a data scientist. And so it's a little bit of like it's a fun learning experience for me every time I hop on a call for a role that I've never heard of before, maybe never recruited for, or don't do it often. And so if you're using a term that is maybe specific to your field, say like, hey, have you heard of this before? Or do you need me to go into more detail? Any of those points of just kind of conversation, sort of like what we're doing now. Like I know it's a phone screen and you're not physically in front of one another, but if you pretended that person was, you take a moment to look at one another. You take a moment to have some feedback. You acknowledge what the person is saying. You might ask another question. So
right. Well, and the one reason I like doing these 2-person presentations is because, quite frankly, irregardless of the topic, if someone is just talking at you for 15 minutes, it's just boring, right? Like think about back to being in school, right? When the teacher's lecturing for 45 minutes straight, like we're not trained to focus for that long. So like Yiorgos is saying, if you can turn it into much more of a conversation, I would imagine you won't start like, you start, if the other person's talking on and on and on, it keeps you more engaged and interested.
Yeah, it's exactly it. Like I like that way of saying it, like you're being talked at, which is always a challenge. Because I'm also, when I'm on a phone screen with someone or just interviewing in general, I'm thinking of like, hey, what would it be like to work with this person? How would they show up every day? And that kind of idea of giving someone a speech for 30 minutes isn't normal to our day-to-day lives. So casual conversation is a little bit more common. And I know it's a lot of work. I'm saying these things and making it seem like it's kind of a quick win or things that you can change overnight. But if you just start to think of that level of empathy of, hey, the person I'm speaking to, what's their environment? And I hope the recruiters that you're speaking with also show you that level of empathy as well. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So thank you for that, Yiorgos. Super valuable. What we're going to do now, guys, is we're going to stick around for a Q&A. If you have any questions, then please feel free to throw it in the chat. We're just going to catch up now.